Ah, Election Day, when Americans everywhere cast their ballot for the next President of the United States. Except, not really. Americans don't directly vote for president. So what's happening on Election Day then? It's a bit complicated because of something called the Electoral College. To keep things simple for now, think of the Electoral College as the collection of 538 votes that determine who the President of the United States will be. Why 538? Because that's the number of senators, 100, plus the number of representatives, 438 in Congress. Why are there 438 representatives in Congress? Stop asking so many questions right now, we're trying to keep this simple. These 538 votes in the Electoral College aren't given to the citizens directly, but are instead divided among the states. So how does the Electoral College give out the votes? Each state, no matter how populous or not, gets 3 votes to start. The remaining votes are given out roughly in proportion to the population of the states. The more people the state has, the more votes it gets. Here's a map of the United States showing the voting power each state has by making one hexagon equal to one Electoral College vote for president. Because Electoral College votes mostly, though not completely, scale with population, it's also a map of where people live with a bonus given to the smaller states to make them a bit bigger than they would otherwise be. In early November, when citizens go to the polls, they aren't voting for president directly, but they're really telling their state how they want it to use its electoral votes. 48 of the 50 states give all their Electoral College votes to the candidate who wins a majority in their state. Take Florida, for example, which has 29 Electoral College votes. If a candidate wins a majority, no matter how small that majority, he gets all the votes. So the path to the White House is clear. Win enough majorities in enough states to get more than half of the Electoral College votes, and you get to sit at the big desk. That wasn't so complicated, you say? Well, there were a few details left out. The Electoral College loves states, but what about the 11 million Americans who don't live in a state? What happens to their vote, and where are these people hiding? There are about 600,000 in the District of Columbia, an area set aside specifically not to be a state so that the capital of the country would be free of local politics. For most of the United States history, people living in the district didn't get to vote for president. Then, in 1964, the Constitution was amended to give D.C. the same number of votes as the least populous state, Wyoming. So the Electoral College likes D.C., but you know who it doesn't like? The territories. The often forgotten Puerto Rico, Guam, U.S. Virgin Islands, and Northern Mariana Islands get no votes from the Electoral College because they aren't states and they don't have a special constitutional amendment to recognize them. Which is a bit odd considering they're part of the United States and everyone who lives there is a citizen, so for most practical purposes they're just like D.C., and 4.4 million people live in the territories. That might not sound like a lot, but it's more than the populations of Wyoming, Vermont, North Dakota, South Dakota, Alaska, and Delaware combined. But still, no votes from the Electoral College do they get. The whole situation with territories is extra strange when you consider the final group of Americans who don't live in the states, the 6.3 million Americans who live abroad. If you're a United States citizen who moves to a foreign country, you can usually send a postal vote to the last state that you resided in. But if you move within the United States to one of its territories, you lose your right to vote for president as long as you live there, making these the only spots on the whole earth where Americans are not allowed to vote for president. Actually, they're the only spots in the whole universe because American astronauts are allowed to vote from space. The last bit of Electoral College complication is the weirdest and has to do with the votes themselves. The state of Florida and all the others don't really give votes to a candidate. That's just a simplified way to think about it, because the reality of the situation is odd. What citizens are voting for on Election Day is a group of electors appointed by the political parties who choose the president on the citizens' behalf. The number of votes that a state gets from the Electoral College is actually the number of electors the state is allowed to send to a collegiate meeting to vote on who the president will be. What makes it odd is that while these electors promise they will vote for president as their state citizens want them to, they aren't required to do so. Electors are free to vote the way they want. While this has never swung an election, 87 times in the past electors have voted against the wishes of the very people who elected them. Why set up this crazy system where a small group of people essentially unknown to the general public are the ones who really decide on the president? Because in the 1700s, when the Electoral College was designed, the quickest way to send a piece of information was to write it down on a piece of paper, hand it to a guy on a horse, wish him Godspeed good sir, and hope he didn't get killed by Indians or die of dysentery along the way. Because information moved so slowly, and because the young country was so big, the idea was to send all the electors to Washington where they could have the most up-to-date information to make decisions for the people back home who wouldn't know the latest news. Though now, when we carry information on beams of light in fiber optic cables rather than on the backs of herd animals, this particular aspect of the Electoral College might seem a little out of date. Nonetheless, while most people think that the election for president takes place in early November, it doesn't. That's the election that determines who the electors will be. The 538 electors who are chosen then meet in early December, and they cast the real votes that determine who is the next president of the United States. Not once, not twice, but thrice in American history, the candidate with the most votes from the people actually lost because of the Electoral College. 4 times now. This has happened 4 times. 3 errors in 55-plus elections is a failure rate of 5%. 7%. Would anyone tolerate a sport where, by a quirk of the rules, there was a 7% chance that the loser would win? Not likely. Hello, Internet. Let's talk about this map, this argument, and the Electoral College in general. In my Trouble with the Electoral College video from 2011, I was wrong to use the city limits for that part of the argument, rather than the more expansive metro area. The lawyerish nerd inside of me still wants to argue technically correct on that one. I use the city boundaries because the metro areas are often vague and absurdly large. The New York metro area is 6,700 plus square miles over 4 states, and from where I partly grew up, it seemed that a lot of that area had nothing to do with New York City proper. So at the time, I disregarded the metro boundaries. But using the strict city boundaries in that video was the wrong decision in retrospect. In addition to being a bad argument to make, it also doesn't address the concerns this map express. And this is correct. Half the population does live in the gray counties. And more than that, the map gets at a fundamental division in the United States and other countries that leads partly to the politics we see, the difference between the rural and the urban. If trends continue, a higher and higher percentage of the country will live in urban areas. In another 8 or 16 years, this map will be even more extreme. The metro areas even denser, which, if you're in favor of the Electoral College, will seem like even more of a reason to keep it. Now, this is where we must discuss the idea that the Electoral College ensures the president is elected by the states. It doesn't. A candidate can win the Electoral College with just the 11 biggest states. This collection may seem unlikely, but as urbanization and the politics it creates continues, it becomes increasingly likely. The Electoral College doesn't ensure the president wins with a lot of states or even geographically diverse states. Now, should the president represent the people or should the president represent the states is a question without an answer. This is about preference in style of governance. One moves power up to the federal level and the other moves power down to the states. And given the vastness of the country and the difference in her geographies, it's reasonable to believe that states with greater power is the better, less divisive solution to the problem of governance. But the Electoral College does nothing to help that. It happens to be that recent wins have been geographically spread, but the Electoral College doesn't ensure that outcome. Cram everyone into California, leaving one person in each state, and the Electoral College says California alone, she decides. We could have a system where the president must win a majority of the states, which is what some think the Electoral College is, but it isn't. The election only happens to make it look that way. The protection of the Electoral College is only an illusion. Even if you still like the Electoral College, though it doesn't actually protect the small states, the Electoral College still comes with the most bitter of anti-republic pills. For even if you win the election in November, your victory can be taken away from you in December. The Electoral College votes your state gets aren't really votes, but are individual members of the political parties who perform the real vote for president in December. No citizen voted for these electors to cast a vote on their behalf, and many of the electors are free to vote for whoever they want. Their election in December is the real election. The Electoral College was designed to be able to overwrite the will of the people or its own election process any time enough of a small number of unknown, unelected political party insiders don't like the result they got. If you're in favor of the Electoral College, you have to accept that by its own rules, it can take away your victory under the guise of protecting you from yourself. This has never happened in American history, nor should it, but it is crazy to leave in place for future elections a system that benefits no citizens and protects no states. It's time to get rid of the Electoral College and have a real discussion about what a modern government and election system should look like.
The peaceful transition of power ritual that was begun at the White House today is performed as much for the world as it is for this country. We take for granted, most of us, the transition of power, but many countries do not. The president and the president-elect played their parts publicly with a version of the Oval Office script that has now been used for generations.
I want to emphasize to you, Mr. President-elect, that we now are going to want to do everything we can to help you succeed, because if you succeed, then the country succeeds.
I very much look forward to dealing with the President in the future, including counsel. Mr. President, it was a great honor being with you, and I look forward to being with you many, many more times in the future. Thank you, sir.
There was a moment there we will show you later in our discussion where Donald Trump said, "I respect," and you had expected him to say President Obama, but he didn't. It wasn't at all clear what he respected. He just couldn't finish that sentence that way because Trump supporters are not quite ready to hear that, if ever. We'll have a full discussion and analysis of what we saw today. But first, in the coverage of today's ritual, there was an important historical fact that was lost. She won. She won the popular vote. Hillary Clinton got more votes than Donald Trump did. She won the presidential election held on Election Day, but that's not enough to win the presidency because we don't elect a president on Election Day. The Electoral College elects a president when they meet on the first Monday after the second Wednesday in December. Now, you know you're deep into the world of ritual when your meeting must occur on the first Monday after the second Wednesday in December. It sounds like you're deep into the world of cultish superstition. Those words are actually written in law to specify when the Electoral College meets. And just by reading them, just by saying them, you can feel the absurdity of the Electoral College, how outdated it is. The Electoral College is one of the most enduring mistakes of the Founding Fathers. And the two men who designed the Electoral College would be horrified at what it has become. They believed that the way it operates today was unconstitutional, a serious violation of the spirit of the Constitution. The Constitution was written by men who did not trust voters. They didn't trust them completely. In the federal government, they allowed voters to elect only members of the House of Representatives. The Constitution said that senators would be elected by state legislators. That wasn't changed until 1913. The Founding Fathers clearly thought that the job of senator was too important to be decided by the man on the street. And that was back when most people couldn't vote. No women were allowed to vote, no slaves were allowed to vote. And only certain kinds of men were allowed to vote. In some areas, you had to own property to vote, indicating that you were a man of substance, a man of judgment. That's what the electors in the Electoral College were supposed to be. Men who could be trusted to choose a president because, in Alexander Hamilton's words, they needed to be men who possessed the information and discernment to make that decision. The Electoral College was designed by Alexander Hamilton and James Madison. Their idea was that on Election Day, voters would vote not for the president, but for an elector, someone smarter than themselves, who then would vote for President of the United States when the Electoral College met at a later date. That date was formalized in law in 1887 as the first Monday after the second Wednesday in December. In Madison and Hamilton's view, the electors were free to vote for whoever they wanted to vote for as president. They believed that back then, New York State's 12 electors each could and should make up his own mind about who the next president should be. New York might produce maybe 4 electoral votes for one candidate, 3 electoral votes for another candidate, 3 electoral votes for another, then 2 for maybe another. They didn't want New York State's electors to get together and make a political deal to all vote for the same candidate. Madison and Hamilton became alarmed when they saw electors in some states realizing that they could do that they could get together and choose a candidate. The electors in certain states then all banded together and voted for the same person so that their candidate would be more likely to win. And Hamilton hated that. And he hated even more the idea that some of the electors would be pre-pledged to vote for a certain candidate for president. He didn't want electors who weren't going to think about who the best president would be. He didn't want electors who were pledged to a candidate and won votes from voters by pledging themselves to a candidate, which is exactly what we have right now. Hamilton said that the point of choosing electors was to make sure that the president would be chosen, quote, by men most capable of analyzing the qualities that a president should have. Hamilton didn't want robots in his electoral college. He thought that would be a violation of the constitutional description of how the electoral college should work. When he saw that the electoral college was being abused, Hamilton actually wrote an amendment to the Constitution to try to correct it, an amendment that was never passed. And so you win the presidency now, not by winning the most votes. You win the presidency by winning the most robots in the Electoral College. An anti-democratic idea, an idea so anti-democratic that no democracy designed after ours has adopted the Electoral College. Our democracy has been a model for centuries for many developing democracies around the world, but none of them chose the Electoral College. No one wants that. Real democracies actually allow people to vote directly for the president. She won the popular vote. That's what you hear, the popular vote. A phrase that exists only in the United States of America. You know what they call the popular vote in the rest of the world? The vote. You win the vote, you win the office. And that is true for every elective office in the United States, from school committee to town council to alderman to mayor to state legislator to governor to Congress to senator, every single elective office in the country except the most important one. And of course, votes in the Electoral College are not democratically distributed throughout the country. They are not fairly distributed according to population. Wyoming only gets 3 electoral votes. That's the least that any state can have. North Dakota and South Dakota each get 3 electoral votes. But there are a lot more people in South Dakota than in Wyoming. Wyoming has 586,000 people. South Dakota has 300,000 more people than that. But it doesn't get 1 more electoral vote than Wyoming. It doesn't get any more electoral votes than Wyoming. It just gets those 3. So South Dakota voters are not as fairly represented in the Electoral College as Wyoming voters are. But California has 39 million people, and it only gets 55 electors in the Electoral College. If California voters got equal representation in the Electoral College to Wyoming voters, California would get 199 electors in the Electoral College. That is how wildly unrepresentative of actual American voters the Electoral College is. The Electoral College was designed when California was still Mexico. It was designed when the variation in population from state to state was nothing like the extremes that we see today. Today's population numbers and the patterns of settlement across the continent were unimaginable to the men who designed the Electoral College, but we're stuck with it. This archaic device designed by men who did not trust voters. It would take a constitutional amendment to rid us of it, which means we're stuck with it for the foreseeable future. We are stuck with an anti-democratic institution that if we observed a foreign country using it, when we go there to foreign countries as election observers to certify the integrity of their elections, we would say, oh, no, 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 you can't do that. Can't do that. I've been an election observer in foreign countries on election day, watching people vote. And no one called it the popular vote. They called it the vote. No one said I was going to have to come back on the first Monday after the second Wednesday in December to watch some small group in a room make the final decision about who the president should be. In any other real democracy, the president-elect today sitting in the Oval Office with President Obama would be Hillary Clinton. But this is the country where you can win the presidency through a political card trick called the Electoral College. She got more votes. More people voted for Hillary Clinton than voted for Donald Trump. And we are now 48 hours into the discussion of what Hillary Clinton didn't understand about America, what she didn't understand about the voters she had to appeal to. 48 hours into the discussion of what the Democrats have to do now to change their message. 48 hours into the discussion of what the party and the candidate who got the most votes must do to get more votes in order to actually win. Only in America. That is a discussion that can happen only in America, where winning the election is not enough to win the office of the presidency. Winning the most votes, not enough. That's what winning the election is in a real democracy, winning the most votes. The world knows this. We have embarrassed ourselves to the world once again. With the world watching twice in 16 years now, the winner of the vote was not sworn in as President of the United States. Do not expect the world to understand that. Do not expect the world to admire our democracy. Alexander Hamilton would be horrified to see the perversion that his Electoral College has become, and he would surely be horrified to see the kind of man who sat beside President Obama today, thanks entirely to Alexander Hamilton's Electoral College.